Good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this session on European harmonization of medical device standards. Our aim is to help you understand the importance of European harmonization and how you can support this process as committee members. For those who doesn't know me, I'm Lindsay Ferrari, the committee manager of committees CH62, Medical Equipment Software and Systems, and CH210, Quality Management Systems and General Aspects for Medical Devices. Before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. This is an interactive session, but during the presentation, I will kindly ask you to put your questions in the chat, and I'll pick them up to be answered during the Q&A. This session is being recorded, and we will provide a link to the recording afterwards. Right, so I'd like to welcome our speaker, Paul Dixon. Many of you already know him. Paul has been contributing to standards development since 2012. He's a member of CH62 and many other committees, not only in the UK, but also at European and international level. Welcome, Paul, and thank you very much for volunteering to hold this session. I'm pretty sure it will be very, very helpful to all of us. So over to you.
Okay, good morning. As Lindsay mentioned, I've been involved in the development of standards both at GB level, but also particularly through ISO, through membership of ISO TC 121, which is responsible for respiratory and anaesthetic equipment. And since 2019 as chair of CEN TC 215, which is the European committee that is charged with harmonization of standards for respiratory and anesthesia equipment and monitoring equipment used in intensive care. So my involvement with standardization started with harmonization to the Medical Devices Directive through the 2010s, and then with the transition to medical device regulation after a hiatus in the early 2020s while the European Commission got their act together. I'm now actively involved in harmonization of medical device standards to the medical device regulation. And so this morning, I plan to present an introduction to the harmonization process and also to dive into some depth the requirements that are needed to write the Annex ZA that is the vehicle to getting a standard accepted for harmonization. The first section, why harmonize? The importance of European harmonization, essentially international standards always have been and can be used as part of an approval process for medical equipment under the medical device regulation, as international standards represent state of the art. But European harmonization provides significantly more regulatory weight. There's a presumption of conformity, which means that a manufacturer doesn't need to justify why a particular standard addresses particular general safety and performance requirements of the medical device regulation. And if harmonization is carried out in parallel during the international development process, that will ensure that the MDR requirements are considered in developing the international standard. So European harmonization of international standards published by IEC and ISO significantly reduce the complexity for manufacturers. It means there's one standard that applies globally, and it reduces the burden that's required in completing a GSPR checklist to demonstrate that your product meets all of the requirements. In order to get a standard approved as harmonized, firstly, the standard needs to be included in a standardization request. So the European Commission issues a document colloquially referred to as a standardization request to ISO and to CEN and CENILEC, listing out standards that they would like to be harmonized. And there are currently some 200 standards listed in the standardization request for medical equipment to be harmonized to medical device regulation. Those are spread across half a dozen different technical committees within CEN and CENELEC. So TC62 in IEC have a significant number. TC210 obviously have the risk management standards and many other standards for general aspects of medical device design. And then there are other technical committees with particular subsectors of medical equipment, such as ISO TC121 for respiratory equipment. The standard, as it's developed, has to have a European annex, colloquially known as an Annex ZA, that demonstrates how the standard addresses the general safety and performance requirements of the medical device regulation. For those of you who are not familiar, the GSPRs are found in Annex 1 of the medical device regulation, EU 745, and there are some 24 clauses within Annex 1, split into sections. So the first section within Annex 1 is general requirements and includes, for example, requirements on the manufacturer's risk management process. Manufacturers shall establish, implement, document, and maintain a risk management system. Generally speaking, the GSPRs within this section are not applicable to a particular standard for a medical device, because particular standards are generally type tested, and these are GSPRs that relate to the manufacturer's processes, but they are, for example, very relevant to the harmonization of ISO 14971 for risk management, in ISO 13485 for risk management, design and manufacturing quality systems. There are then a series of requirements, often broken down into some detail for design and manufacture, and this is really the section where a particular standard can focus its efforts. That your standard is likely to be providing normative requirements that would demonstrate safety and effective performance, and they are very likely to be capable of being linked to requirements of the GSPRs. At each stage in the process, the standard and the Annex ZA are assessed together for conformity through what's known as the HAS assessment process. HAS isn't really initials anymore, but there's a process whereby the annex and the standard are submitted to CEN-CENELEC Central Secretariat. They then forward them to Ernst & Young, who have the contract from the European Commission to do conformity assessment of standards. The standard is assessed and comments are presented, been submitted in ISO and IEC ballots. And presuming that the standard, when it gets to publication, has an approved Annex ZA, then the public standard is offered for the European Commission to harmonise. And the final step is that the European Commission lists the standard in the official journal of the European Union, under the link here. So, for example, in 28th of January 2026, there was a listing that included harmonised standards for neurosurgical implants, some biological evaluation within the ISO 10993 series, clinical investigation, which I think is the ISO 14155, and so on. And the detailed lists can be found in multiple languages of the European Union from this page. To go into the process in more detail, what do you have to do and when? So firstly, if possible, develop the Annex ZA really early in the development of an international standard. If at all possible, you should have an Annex Z ready at the same time that you submit text for CD committee draft ballot. There are 4 assessments possible for the Annex Z during the development of a standard. If you miss a stage, then that's just tough. You don't get another bite. So to get the best probability that you've addressed all of the feedback from the HAS assessors, it's advisable to try and get the Annex Z developed and submitted in parallel with each of the committee draft DIS and final DIS ballots. And I apologise that I'm probably using ISO terminology there, and it may be slightly different in IEC. Committee stage, inquiry, and final vote. And if there is still a lack of compliance at the final vote stage, there is the potential for one further assessment after in parallel with the international publication. So at each stage, prepare an Annex ZA in parallel with the standard. They need to be submitted together for the consultation ballot, and they are tightly coupled because, as you'll see later, the Annex Z references the numbered clauses within the draft. The assessment process is anonymized. You don't get to find out which of the HAS assessors is working on your document, but the working group can request a meeting with the assessor following each assessment for clarification. Obviously, at that meeting, you'll find out who it is. It is preferred that you carry out the assessment at CD because that allows technical comments from the HAS consultant to the text of the standard to be addressed before you go to inquiry, alongside the IEC and ISO expert comments. Mindful that technical changes are much more difficult after the DIS stage, after inquiry, and so can significantly extend the timeline for the project. And the one good piece of news is that IEC and ISO procedures no longer hold up a publication for a failed HAS assessment, as was happening for the last 2 or 3 years. So development in parallel, certainly for the years 2021 to 2024, if the HAS assessment was either late back or failed, it could delay the international project. That is no longer the case. So, how to write an Annex ZA? The Annex ZA template is essentially boilerplate text with 3 sections that need to be completed, or up to 3 sections that need to be completed. There is a table for correspondence between the clauses of the standard and the general safety and performance requirements of the MDR. There's a table to address normative references, and in particular the dating of references and the European edition of references. And there is a table to cover defined terms that are defined in the standard but also have legal meaning under MDR. So that particularly means if you have a definition in clause 3 of your standard that conflicts with a definition in Article 2 of the medical device regulation. So if I flip back to the medical device regulation, go back up to Article 2. Article 2 is a list of definitions. If your standard defines medical device or accessory or active device or anything else that's listed here, then you need to include the annex, the table ZA3 that addresses how that definition should be interpreted. It should be interpreted when referring to the standard. There's a link here for the template. And you can see there's a large amount of boilerplate text, and there's table ZA1. This is a template just with table ZA1, table ZA2, and ZA3 are available elsewhere on the SEN website. But the first part of my presentation will be just explaining what you have to put into this table. I would point out in some rare cases, you also need to include the General Safety and Performance Requirements of the Machinery Directive. Most medical equipment doesn't constitute machinery, but something like an operating room table would. Machinery is defined as something that has external moving parts that are driven. Things like infusion pumps and ventilators have moving parts, but they're internal. They don't count as machinery. So in table ZA1, you're going to list each of the general safety and performance requirements that you believe is addressed by a requirement or requirements within your standard. So this is just another link to the GSPRs. For each GSPR that is included, you're going to list the clauses and subclauses of the standard that address that requirement. You're going to include some notes to explain the scope of coverage. Do not include a GSPR in the table if there's no technical solution provided to address the requirement. And as noted before, some GSPRs almost never apply. For example, the risk management process, the manufacturer should be referencing EN ISO 14971 as the harmonized standard and not a particular standard for a product. So I'll go through several examples of how you can claim coverage and things that do work and things that do get thrown back by the assessors. My recommendation is that you start out by going through the standard and for each clause, identify where in the GSPR that clause would fit and go as granular as possible. If you start out with the GSPRs, it's a much more burdensome process because you'll be reading a lot of GSPRs that are not relevant to your product. If you start with the clauses of the standard, tie them to the GSPRs and then use that to fill in the table essentially by reversing the traceability. That seems to work better. So you're going to use your list to identify all of the GSPRs that you think are covered, either fully or in part by clauses of your standard. And then you're going to list those in the table and include notes. So an example, GSPR 20.3 devices should be designed and manufactured in such a way as to reduce to the lowest possible level the risks arising from noise emitted. I'm going to provide you an example from I think this is from ISO 11197 medical supply systems. Clause 9.7 of that standard says, except for noise caused by therapeutic or diagnostic measures by adjustment of the supply unit during operation, blah, 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 the medical supply unit shall not produce acoustic energy in excess of, and it provides values. And the manufacturer provide evidence upon request, so specified sound levels are not exceeded. So you have a technical solution. You've got defined levels that address the GSPR for noise emission, and we can list that in our Annex Z. The GSPR is simply listed by number in the left-hand column. The clause or clauses of the European standard, the international standard, it's clause 9.7, and in this case, the remark would simply be covered in full, or to be honest, if it is covered in full, you can leave the remark empty. More commonly, you'll have a GSPR that's covered in part. For example, 10.1, devices should be designed and manufactured in such a way as to ensure characteristics, performance requirements are fulfilled, blah, 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 particularly as regards toxicity and, where relevant, flammability. In this same standard for medical supply systems, we have a couple of clauses that relate to excess temperatures and fire prevention. Once again, these clauses both have a shall, they are normative requirements, and they cover the temperatures of luminaires and also the fire safety of the enclosure as a whole. So in this case, we included the GSPR 10.1a, we listed both of the two clauses of the standard, and we have a remark that says that it's covered with respect to flammability and the temperature associated with luminaires. It specifically doesn't address the choice of materials and substances as regards toxicity. So the remark demonstrates the scope of the coverage. Another example, unintentional ingress. So again, this is from IEC 60601-2-83, which is it's a TC62D standard for home light therapy equipment. So this is a standard that's written in the 60601 style with the clause numbering beginning with 200. 211.8.3.1 ingress of water or particulate matter. This one is actually referencing clause of 11.6.5 of the general standard, but it has some very specific requirements. So, for example, the IP rating being at least IP21, the use of safety signs and symbols. So this was accepted by the assessors. So addresses clause 10.5 in respect of ingress of water and particulate matter. Another example, this one is the only example I have of a clause within the general section, so GSPR within the general section. Manufacturers shall reduce as far as possible risks related to ergonomic features of the device and the environment, and give consideration to the technical knowledge, experience, etc. of users. In the case of this standard is ISO 80601-2-69, which is a standard for oxygen concentrators used in the home. Again, we have it's a 60601 style standard. We have an accuracy of controls and instruments that references both the clarity and legibility of the markings, which addresses to an extent 10.5a, and it has a number of sub-clauses that refer to the way in which it is operated. And we also have a usability clause, 206, which discusses primary operating functions. So, configuring the oxygen concentrator, setting flow rate. Because these are listed as primary operating functions, the test report will demonstrate that these have been through valid human factors validation, and therefore we can justify use of clause 201.12.1 for the clarity and legibility of controls, and we can use the subclauses within 206 for the primary operating functions because they are required to be evaluated by the usability engineering process, and that was accepted by the assessors. Another example, internal power supply. In this case, this is the same oxygen concentrator standard. We have a conditional requirement. If the oxygen concentrator has an internal electrical power source, then it shall meet these requirements. In this case, the coverage was accepted. 18.2 is regarded as being covered by this clause, but only when the internal power supply is included in the product. So if you have an oxygen concentrator that has an internal power supply, you can use this clause to show coverage of 18.2. If your product does not, you cannot. And so the interpretation of the table in the Annex ZA in the published standard provides information for the user of the standard, the manufacturer that's using the standard, as well as for the assessors during the assessment process. Another example, clause 23.1, general requirements regarding information supplied. This is a huge clause within GSPR. It's got bullets that run up to about N. And in this case, we have a clause within the oxygen concentrator standard that talks about legibility of markings and so on, and it also covers information supplied by the manufacturer, and it has a requirement that that information conform with ISO 20417. And it has some additional guidance as to how to apply 20417. That's significant because the assessors will, if you simply reference a horizontal standard, the assessors will sometimes say you should be, the manufacturer should be using the horizontal standard for that GSPR and not the particular. Providing guidance on how to use the horizontal standard is helpful in demonstrating that your standard really does cover that GSPR. So in this case, the assessor accepted that, but insisted on a comment being added that the part relating to a website in 23.1 is not addressed. And note that 23.1 is assumed to only reference the text before the bullet A. So 23.1A, 23.1B, and so on will all need to be included separately if they were going to be included in the table. So just to emphasize that, the assessor also recommended that the text first paragraph be added. Another example where a GSPR might be covered but conditional to design. This is actually 23.4H. Sorry, it's not very easy to tell that, but where appropriate information should take the form of internationally recognized symbols, and symbols and colors should conform to harmonized standards or common specifications. This is a clause from the oxygen concentrator standard that I've been using as an example, and you can see here that it's got references to symbols, symbol 7.31-1 and so on of an IEC 62570, which is the standard for marking for MR safety. There's also a reference to a symbol in ISO 7000. If you read this carefully, you can see that although A1 does say shall have markings in accordance with, A3 simply says may be used. And so when this went to assessment, the HAS assessment agreed that this 23.1 was covered in part by 201.7.2.101A, but they insisted on a remark that it's only covered when the symbols that are indicated in Annex D are actually used by the manufacturer. So this is another example of a remark in the Annex Z that does need to be considered by the manufacturer when they're determining whether or not they can claim this clause. Finally, I'll go through some examples of GSPRs that have not been accepted by the assessment process. So, firstly, GSPR 15.1, which is a requirement for diagnostic devices and devices with measuring function. The clause in the international standard for oxygen concentrator for accuracy of triggered flow reads, for an oxygen concentrator with integrated conserving equipment function, the requirements are found in. Because this sentence does not include a shall, it's not a normative requirement, and the HAS assessment process doesn't allow you to take credit if there isn't a normative requirement. And this is justifiable if you bear in mind that neither will a test laboratory. Test laboratories testing to standards routinely only test for those clauses that have a shall. So in this case, the GSPR was covered in respect of, this was the attempt. It was assessed as lack of compliance because the requirement isn't written as a shall. Had it been rewritten like this, this is this is actually an example out of a different standard, but if it had been written as integrated oxygen conserving equipment shall conform with, then that would have been accepted by the HAS assessment. But obviously that's a change to the normative text. This is an example of a European requirement that really needs to be included into the international standard before you go to inquiry, because the change from requirements can be found in to the equipment shall conform with is a technical change, and if that happens following DIS, then it triggers the need for an FDIS that might otherwise not be needed. Another example, GSPR 17.2 about software development life cycles and risk management. We have a clause in the oxygen concentrator standard that says an oxygen concentrator should, and risk control measures should. Shoulds are not normative. So even though we initially tried to claim coverage, that was assessed as lack of compliance. You can't take credit for a clause that doesn't include the word shall. Right. I'm going to take a break for 10 seconds to catch my breath. So this is moving on to the second part of the Annex ZA, which is the dating of normative references. Unless every normative reference in the standard is to a dated European norm, and that really would only ever be applicable to homegrown EN standards, that is a standard that's been written within CEN or CENELEC, you're required to have a table ZA2 that lists every normative reference from clause 2 and that gives a corresponding dated international and European reference. Any normative reference that is not to an ISO or an IAC standard, so for example, if you've got a normative reference in the international document to an ASTM, which is deemed to be a US national standard, that needs to be identified at an early stage prior to submission, and you need to write a rationale for why your standard is referencing a document that's not an international standard. At CD and DIS stages, you can have reference to draft standards in the clause 3 and in the Annex Z, but once you get to final vote, reference to draft standards are no longer permitted. And if there are normative references in clause 3 of the standard to a standard that has been withdrawn, so if the IEC ISO document references a standard that's been withdrawn and replaced, it may be possible to reference the replacement within Annex ZA, but only if you can confirm that the equivalent protections exist in the newer version. So I'll now go through some examples of the different sorts of references you might need. So first example, standard that's listed in clause 2, not 3. The standard listed in clause 2 is already a dated ISO or IEC standard, and there is an equivalent an identical EN publication. Then you list the international standard in columns 1, 2, and 3, and the equivalent EN publication in column 4. So, for example, IEC 6247-1/2006, it already has a date, so the column 2 is identical. Column 3 is just the title of the standard, and the column 4 has the EN 62471 with the dated EN reference. And you'll note that in some cases the European publication is a year or several later than the international publication. Undated references in clause 2 are challenging. If at all possible, avoid using undated references when you're developing the international standard. If there is a standard listed in clause 2 that is undated, and the current version as that standard has an identical EN publication, then you can list that by giving the date of the European edition in column 4 and the date of the international standard edition that is equivalent to the EN publication in column 2. This is not necessarily the newest edition of the international standard if the European publication is out of sync. So bear in mind, this is not the newest edition. It's the edition that corresponds to the newest edition within Europe. And here you can see that each of these has been dated, and the in the last case we have an example where there's three EN ISO standards for breathing gas pathway compatibility with different date from the ISO. So you have dated references in column 2, dated references to European standards in column 4 if at all possible, and if there is no date in column 1, the date in column 2 should correspond to the international edition that is equivalent to the European publication. If the standard has been withdrawn and replaced, then you should list the current European edition in column 4. So in this case, ISO 2505 Part 1 1994 has been replaced in Europe by EN ISO 52505-1 2023. Because the column 1 is dated, column 2 has the same date, but the column 4 has the date of the version that is to be referenced when interpreting the standard in Europe. If the standard listing clause 2 is in draft, then column 4 should say not yet available. And this will only be permitted up to this. Once you get to final vote, that needs to be addressed somehow else. If there is no European equivalent, then you simply list none in column 4. And so in this case, the ISO standard, which is very old, was never published as European standard. You just put for, you either put none or you put for applicable standard edition, see column 2. ASTM standards, as I mentioned previously, if your clause 2 reference has normative references to non-international standards, then you need to write a rationale for that, and it needs to be provided before you make the submission. It should be provided to the Sentinel desk officer. Final part of the annex is define terms with legal meaning. If your standard defines any terms that clash with terms that are listed in Article 2 of the MDR, then you need to include a table prevailing terms of regulation for use of this European standard, and you have to provide details of the differences between the definition in the standard and the definition under MDR. And a manufacturer interpreting the standard and using it to claim conformity must use the MDR definition in interpreting the standard. So we create this table that lists the terms that are defined in clause 3 that are also have a legal meaning, and a statement about how they're to be interpreted. So this is the term, this is where it's been defined in our standard, this is where it's defined in Article 2 of the MDR, and in this case, accessory. Use under MDR, only accessories for a medical device are focused instead of accessories for use with equipment, and there's the consequences of that. So the MDR meaning is required to prevail when the manufacturer is interpreting the standard. Another example, a different standard with clinical evaluation and clinical investigation, defined terms within the standard that have legal meaning. Finally, there is a harmonized standards checklist. At each point that you submit a standard and its Annex Z for assessment, you also have to submit a copy of this common checklist. Common checklist is available from this link. It has a number of parts. It's part A that needs to be filled in by the technical committee that are writing the standard. So obviously standard reference, the work item reference, and so on are fairly straightforward. The bulk of the work that you need to cover is this section 1.1, which is a series of checkboxes for, firstly, is the standard listed in a standardization request? If it is, you click fulfilled. If it's not, then you then need to provide a justification. For example, this standard is not in the standardization request yet, but it's listed in the draft for the third amendment to the standardization request, and so will be listed in 12 months' time. If you have had comments from a previous assessment stage, you have to confirm that you've addressed them all. If you do, and when you do that, you also have to provide the disposition of comments to the HAS assessment alongside the alongside the new annex. So various other checkboxes. I mean, some of them are boilerplate. The forward includes the following sentence. That's in the boilerplate European forward. That's always required. The standards listed in clause 2 are normatively referenced in the text. Fulfilled or not fulfilled. It used to be common that a technical committee would include standards in clause 2, but not actually have them normatively referenced within a clause. ISO Central Secretariat will usually pick that up, but if not, you can assume that the European assessors are likely to as well. They often pick up things that the ISO editors have missed. So there's a set of 11 questions that need to be filled in, all just check boxes by the technical committee, and then the rest of this is summary of assessment by HAS consultant. You don't need to consider it. So I've included a list of several resources. So this is linked to the common checklist we've just looked at. The templates for the Annex Z are at this reference on the CEN-CENELEC website. This is linked to all the CEN-CENELEC Management Committee guidance documents, the particular reference for normative references and the Annex table ZA2, and also to some CEN webinars that I've found useful. That completes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Paul. Yes, there are some questions here in the chat. I will just read it for you. So first one, given the broad wording of GSPR, such as the requirement to reduce as far as possible risks linked to the ergonomic features, how does a HAS consultant judge the technical adequacy of the requirements in a candidate standard? What specialist expertise do they rely on? And do they draw on input from other safety domains where topics such as ergonomics or software are covered?
So generally, the HAS assessors for medical device regulation are all people who have, and there are about 6 of them, they're people who've been assessing specifically medical device standards for a number of years. They come from a variety of backgrounds. There's at least one that used to be an academic biomedical engineer in Wales, and very much involved in the standards development process in the through from the 1990s onwards. Several others have come from regulatory backgrounds, but they do generally assess them on the basis of their understanding of the medical device domain. I've rarely seen a comment that seems to pull in input from other safety domains, although obviously if your standard pulls in that domain, then it will be considered, but I haven't seen feedback suggesting that you should. The assessors obviously aren't experts in the particular device that your standard is addressing. So to that extent, they're relying on reading your standard as a person with experience of auditing medical device regulatory submissions, or experience of writing medical equipment standards, but often without knowing the details of the particular equipment. Most of the comments that I've seen come back have been related to the way that the GSPR has been interpreted by the technical committee, rather than pulling in outside information. I don't know if that's addressed the question, but
Thank you, Paul. There is a request here to go over again, referencing known internal standards such as
ASTM.
ASTM, yes.
Yes. So the advice from the Sentinelec officer that's responsible for liaison with technical committees in terms of submission of annexes and standards for the assessment is, if you're going to reference a standard that is not an international standard, and when all ISO and IEC standards are international. There are a list of other bodies, for example, ETSI, I think their standards are treated as international, but ASTM are definitely not. If your standard has a normative reference to an ASTM standard, then you need to explain why it's not been possible to replace that with an international standard, and that rationale needs to be provided preferably several weeks before the standard is submitted for assessment. The assessment process, you're supposed to submit the Annex Z. You upload it at the same time as you create the CD or the inquiry ballot. So if you're going to be referencing a national standard in the clause 2, you need to contact the European officer a couple of weeks before that submission with a rationale for why that's required. I think the assumption is that if they accept that, they will let you know that it's acceptable. And if they don't accept it, you've still got some time to try and influence the text before it gets submitted for ballot. I'm aware of having successfully referenced national standards in the biocompatibility for respiratory gas pathway standards, specifically for test methods where there is no international standard for a particular test method. And so it was accepted that we have a normative reference to an ASTM, simply because there is no international standard for the equivalent test.
Okay, so what do you think are the most common weaknesses seen in Annex ZA drafting during harmonization assessments?
So the things that usually come back are you've referenced you've referenced a clause in your standard that is too broad. So if you have a clause to it's a 6061 style standard, you're quite likely to have a clause 201.11.6 with several subclauses within it. If you want to reference two of them, reference 201.11.6.6 and 201.11.6.7. If you just reference 201.11.6 and it has other clauses that are not relevant to that GSPR, that will get pointed out by the assessor, and you'll be asked to be more specific. They really don't like, because they read everything that's listed. They don't like reading stuff that's not relevant to the GSPR that they're trying to review, and that would go for the manufacturer as well. When the manufacturer is trying to demonstrate conformity, they want the smaller number of clauses that are directly relevant to be listed. Failing to explain the scope where the coverage is not full. It is relatively uncommon to cover a GSPR in full. There's almost invariably some limitation of scope, and if you ignore that and you list it as fully covered everywhere, you will get that will get pulled up. You'll get a lack of you'll get a lack of compliance with comments that you need to explain the scope. In many cases, the assessors will actually provide the text for you. I mean, I've often had a comment come back in a HAS assessment that says something like, you need to include X, Y, Z in your remarks column, to demonstrate the restriction of scope. So they sometimes some of the assessors in particular are more helpful than others. So you'll sometimes get a comment back that basically tells you what you need to do to address it. I can see the next question is, who is responsible for making this process happen? The committee chairman. There will always be a CEN or CENELEC committee that is responsible for the European harmonization. That committee is quite, certainly in the ones that I'm involved in, there will be working groups that are responsible for standards within individual subcommittees or working areas of the overall TC, and that working group have the responsibility in the same way that within ISO or IEC, a working group is responsible for developing the text of the standard. Who is responsible for making the process happen? The committee. In practice, I think that is a liaison between, a collaboration between the CEN or CENELEC committee chair, the working group convener for the relevant working group in CEN or CENELEC, and the project manager within the international working group. Obviously, you need that collaboration between the international and European representation, because the Annex Z needs to be developed in parallel. The numbering needs to be developed in parallel. If clauses get renumbered in the international standard, that has an impact on the Annex Z. The next question is, what is the route to take a CEN harmonized standard to be an ISO standard under the Vienna Agreement? So if there is a European standard and it is harmonized, then adopting that at ISO level would require a national member body of the ISO technical committee would have to submit that as a work item to ISO. It would have to gain the support of 5 national member bodies at the ISO technical committee, and it would then go through the development process under Vienna Agreement, and would almost certainly result in changes to and a new edition of the standard. Frankly, that's something I've seen very rarely. The only examples I've seen recently of CEN or CENELEC standard being adopted by ISO, it's been significantly rewritten, and it wasn't harmonized to MDR first. It may have been harmonized to MDD many years ago, but I'm not aware of any native, homegrown CEN standards in this field that harmonized already to MDR. The opposite does happen more commonly, which is that there's an ISO standard which gets all the way through to publication without being involved in the harmonization process. There is a mechanism for CEN or CENELEC adopting an international standard with a European-only amendment that simply adds the European forward and the Annex Z. That is actually not under the Vienna Agreement. It's a European-only process, but that would require the CEN or CENELEC technical committee to open a new work item to make a European amendment, attach the Annex Z, and submit that for assessment. That can work, but obviously doesn't provide any opportunity to address any comments that the CEN assessors have for the normative text of the standard, because you're unable to make changes to the ISO text. Next question is, how should standards writers approach situations where a requirement is only partially addressed by the standard, or where conformity depends heavily on manufacturer implementation? If the ideally you would want to develop the standard so it coverage is as broad as possible. If the requirement is only partially addressed by the standard, and that will frequently be the case because GSPRs are not terribly well structured, and some of them include requirements that are quite disparate within a single GSPR. So there was an example earlier of a GSPR that covered both toxicity and flammability of materials. It's very likely that you'll have requirements that address flammability. You might, if your device is patient contact, also have requirements for toxicity, but they're likely to be in very different parts of your standard. Where conformity depends heavily on manufacturer implementation. If this is conditional to a design decision, so for example, if it's conditional to whether or not you use international symbols, or it's conditional to whether or not you have an internal power supply, that's fairly straightforward. If it's conditional on the detail of manufacturer implementation beyond that, I'm not sure it would be capable of being addressed by a traceability from a GSPR to a clause of the standard. From your experience, what differentiates committees that are particularly effective at progressing harmonized standards work within CEN or CENELEC? Frankly, it's difficult to tell at this stage because it's only been in the last 18 months that the process has been working at all well. That's for several reasons. Firstly, the Ernst & Young contract lapsed with the end of the Medical Device Directive harmonization, and it took the European Commission 2 years to get a new contract in place. So there was a 2-year hiatus in harmonization assessments. And then last year there was an 18-month hiatus in the publication of listings in the official journal of the European Union following the Malamud copyright case, which some of you may be aware. There was a European case where it was found by the courts that because harmonized standards have legal force, the European Union should make them available to consumers free of charge. And that obviously conflicts with the ISO IEC approach to funding, which is to publish standards as copyright documents and to sell them by the copy. And that was progressing its way through the courts, but for a significant amount of time there was a legal case from ISO and IEC against the European Commission to prevent them listing things in the official journal because of the risk that the ISO IEC copyright would then be rendered void. And I believe that's now been addressed, that where consumers do request copies of standards, it's addressed as an individual access matter and funded by the national standards organization in the country where that consumer resides. Are there particular stages in the process where technical comments from national experts tend to have the greatest influence? The earlier the better. If you get a technical comment back from the technical comments from the national experts, not from the assessors. I think I would still say the earlier in the process, the better. I have never seen an Annex Z get through its assessment as conformant at first try. So I would always assume that you start with the Annex Z as early as possible so that you get the most opportunity to address the questions from the assessor. Next question, and I'm aware of the fact we're close to time. When there's a lack of harmonized standards on a specific topic, such as EN 62304 under MDR, and 62304, for those that don't know, is the software development lifecycle standard, what criteria do notified bodies use during conformity assessment? So if there is not a harmonized standard on a particular topic, then the manufacturer is expected to use state of the art, and international standards can always be used to demonstrate state of the art. The difference between a harmonized standard and a non-harmonized standard is the presumption of conformity. That you're still going to have to produce a GSPR checklist as part of your technical documentation. if in that checklist you reference for a particular GSPR that your evidence is a test report to a standard, and that test report is harmonized, and the Annex Z in the harmonized standard lists that GSPR, then the notified body simply presume that is acceptable, and they don't scrutinize the evidence. If it's a state of art, then they're entitled to go look at the test report and scrutinize whether they think the test report covers the GSPR. So yes, manufacturers certainly can choose other technical standards like IEEE and indeed ASTM and national standards from outside Europe, but you're going to have to provide, the manufacturer is going to have to provide a justification to the notified body in that case. The harmonization simply short circuits the notified body request for rationale.
In the interest of time, I just wanted to ask you to give a final opinion or encouragement to people to join those harmonization process at the European level, at technical committees, European technical committees. What would you say to committee members that could encourage them to join?
I think I would encourage them to get involved. There certainly are resources out there, and there are people that can help with the structuring of the annexes. And I think the benefits of harmonization are twofold. Firstly, there's a benefit for manufacturers because it does reduce the work that's required in demonstrating to your notified body that you've met the GSPR. And secondly, at least for some products, we're well aware of the fact that the European Commission have an approach using common specifications that's applied in a number of other sectors outside medical, where a common specification is essentially a European standard that's developed entirely within Europe, not using Standards Development Organization, but essentially using legal consultants to write a specification. The risk for manufacturers if we get common specifications in the medical devices field is very significant, and so making sure that we do have standards coming through the harmonization pipeline and being listed as harmonized to MDR is a very significant step towards ensuring the Commission don't try and foist common specifications onto our products. But okay.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive overview of the process. We do encourage everyone to join. If you are interested in contributing with this process, please contact your committee manager. They will be able to nominate you to the respective SEN committee. Thanks, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Bye.